Hello and welcome to Separated by Force, Afstandsmoeders in the Netherlands. My name is Sarah Tekath, and today we are leaving the Netherlands to travel back to a country that no longer exists. In the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, children were used as political leverage for decades. The state took the children away from families who were found to be non-compliant with the system, imprisoned the parents, and placed the children in children's homes. Some were later passed on to families who did conform to the system. Only after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 were the families able to reunite, but some never found each other again. My colleague Anne Klesse is a freelance journalist in Hamburg and writes for Welt am Sonntag, Welt, Zeit.de, and the journalist network Deine Korrespondentin. In 2009, she did research for the Berliner Morgenpost on the topic of GDR children and met Katrin Beer, who was forcibly separated from her mother as a child. Welcome, Anne Klesse.
Hallo.
How did you come across the topic of the separation of parents and their children in the GDR?
Ich habe 10 Jahre lang in Berlin gelebt und
For 10 years I lived in Berlin and I visited privately and professionally the former central remand prison of the Ministry of the State Security of the GDR several times, which is now Berlin Hohenschönhausen Memorial. Once I have met a former prisoner there and he shared his experience with me and his personal story. Political prisoners were held captive in this prison until the court ruling. This personal story touched me very much. It was there that I learned that children of political prisoners were taken away from them. I started to investigate what has happened to these children, and this was the start of my idea to tell the stories of these people.
Had you previously heard of this topic? Was this in any way addressed at school?
No, I grew up in Hamburg, which was West Germany at that time, and I didn't have any family members in the GDR. Only as an adult, when I started traveling, studying, and working as a journalist, I met people from the ex-GDR. Until then, I never had any personal relationship with people who lived on the other side of the wall. From Hamburg, the wall was also really far away. It might have been different if I had grown up in Berlin. People who lived there were really close, only a few meters away. They could see the wall and hear the noises from behind it. Some colleagues in Berlin told me later that they have lived so close to the wall that they could actually see the other side. I was only 12 at the fall of the Berlin Wall, and frankly, the topic didn't affect me much. Also, we didn't really talk about the GDR and about the separation of Germany at school. It clearly wasn't a priority. We spoke only briefly about the fact that the wall was built and that another German state existed, but that was pretty much it. We were never confronted with personal stories or with the way people lived in the GDR. Looking back, I think that that's really pity.
During your research for your article, was it difficult for you to find people that were willing to share their experiences with you?
Of course, forced adoption is a very personal and emotional topic. For the people who have been affected by it, it is like an open wound and a trauma which stays even though the children might have experienced their childhood as a happy one because they have forgotten about their biological parents, because they were too young to remember or they might have suppressed it. We also need to keep in mind that these children were given to the system-conform families. They were raised according to the socialist idea. For them, it means that with the end of the GDR, everything they knew fell apart. We are talking about a collective trauma, which affects generations of East Germans, which is also a topic currently researched. Everything they had believed in suddenly wasn't right anymore. They had to start all over again, even though most of them somehow had found a way to cope with life in the GDR in order to survive. Via several organizations which are now trying to help reconnect families, I have found people who were personally affected. But when I worked on my article in 2009, the fall of the wall was already 20 years behind us. At that point, many parents have already passed away. But nonetheless, I have found some people willing to share their stories with me, which I was able then to publish in a newspaper. Many of them said that their motivation to participate was to create awareness of the topic. Because even today, many people don't know anything about what had gone wrong in the state of the GDR.
In dem Unrechtsstaat DDR so passiert ist.
How did the system of forced adoption work in the GDR? Could you describe this a bit more?
Der SED-Staat,
the leading party, SED, has purposefully used the parents' fear of losing their children. People were threatened that their children will be taken away if they do or don't do a certain thing the state wanted them to do. A civil rights activist, who was also a father or a mother, was in constant danger of losing their child because the state felt like these people were unable to raise their children according to the socialist idea. It was not even necessary to be imprisoned in that case. It was already enough to be considered an opponent of the regime by following the international media. The family code of the GDR stated that parents were obliged to raise their children to become active builders of socialism, to appreciate work, to love the state of the GDR and the Soviet Union, and to protect their borders, if necessary by force of arms. If parents refused to do so, authorities of the GDR had the right to withdraw custody from them. If they did something the state didn't approve of, or if they had a certain lifestyle, their children were taken away from them. Very often the parents were blackmailed into signing documents of approval of the adoption. The same thing happened to people who tried to flee from the GDR or who were unemployed. These people were considered asocial, and they as well had their children taken away. Overall, these were politically motivated child abductions, which later led to forced adaptations into system-conform families. This means the people were first criminalized and later forcefully separated from their children.
How many people have been affected by this forced adoption?
Ganz genau weiß man das nicht, weil es keine Statistiken gibt.
That can't be said for sure, because there are no statistics of forced adaptations. The International Society for Human Rights, as well as the German Red Cross, have documented multiple cases. But from my point of view, the cases of politically motivated child abductions and forced adaptations are still a dark chapter. Many people are still not informed about it, therefore they don't engage in it, they don't question it or don't know to whom to turn in order to get help. Additionally to this, there is an issue that the documents of the state security of the GDR may have never been processed. Some of them were destroyed, others were not traceable. Furthermore, today, the system-conformed families of the GDR have very little interest to have the situation investigated. Others might just have found their peace with their personal life story. For example, those who weren't obvious opponents of the regime, but were considered asocial, for instance, women who had multiple sexual partners or people who were unemployed. They are even today often ashamed of their life stories. This is a group where one can find a lot of broken personalities who never really got back on their feet again. Which is probably also one of the reasons why it is so difficult to name specific numbers. The Berlin Association Wall Museum is aware of hundreds of cases, even though we are probably talking about thousands here, which can already be confirmed now by the number of thousands of children who have been put into children's homes when their parents got arrested. Most of them stayed in those children's homes. They were never adopted into conformist families.
For the people that have been affected by this system, was there any chance to get out of this without giving up their children?
I think it was almost impossible to get out of the system. Critical voices of the political system were always in danger of being arrested. Many people have tried to flee from the GDR. Some have succeeded, but many have paid with their lives. So yes, it was very difficult.
One of the children that has been taken away by the system of the GDR is Katrin Beer, and you've met her in Berlin in 2009. Could you explain what happened to her afterwards, after she had been separated from her mother?
At the fall of the Berlin Wall, Katrin was 22 years old. When I met her 20 years later, She was already in her 40s. After she had been abducted, her mother was forced to give her for adoption. Her mother, for example, was one of the people who were considered asocial. She wasn't working at that time. Additionally, also previously, she had already caught the eye of the state security because she had been thinking about applying for an exit visa. It is also important to note that the decision whose child was to be taken away was not always made by the court. Very often the approval of the Youth Welfare Office was enough. So only a few days after the abduction, Katrin and her brother were brought into a children's home to be adopted. In there, Katrin was asked to spend a weekend with a new family, but she cried the entire time during the stay. She also had the reputation of being a crybaby at the children's home because she was unable to forget what has happened to her. She was also visited by her grandmother once, and her grandmother just wiped away her tears and said to her, "Your previous family doesn't exist anymore. Go get yourself a new one." This was very harsh, of course. 2 years later, in December 1973, she was brought into another family and she was told that this would be her last chance. She was raised by system-compliant parents and without her brother. He was given to another family without her knowing.
Did she tell you a bit more about this new family that had adopted her? You said they were system conform. Was she raised according to the socialist idea?
Ja, wurde sie wohl.
Yes, she was raised according to the socialist idea, but it wasn't all bad in this family. She was actually very well taken care of. The couple she got to live with also had wished to become parents for a long time, so they were quite happy to finally have her. She was raised in a system-conform way, but she never forgot what had happened to her, which is quite remarkable considering her young age. Nonetheless, I do think that she got traumatized.
Ja, ist schon traumatisiert, würde ich sagen.
Did Katrin and her mother manage to find each other again afterwards?
Ja, haben sie. Man könnte meinen, das wäre dann das Happy End sozusagen.
Yes, they did manage to find each other again, but it wasn't the happy end everybody was hoping for. Katrin Beer gave birth to 2 children herself. After the birth of her second child, she started searching for her own mother. This was in 1990, 1 year after the fall of the Berlin Wall. She had asked her adoptive mother for contact information, which wasn't necessarily received well, but in the end she did hold a note with an address in Gera in her hands. Gera is the place where she was born. First, she admitted she was too afraid to call the phone number or to visit the mother, and 1 year passed. In the end, she has sent a letter to her mother, and already within 2 days she received an answer. Next day she drove to Gera and rang a doorbell, and an elderly woman opened the door, and mother and daughter were facing each other and they fell into each other's arms. On one hand, this was very emotional and overwhelming, but on the other hand, this also shows how much time has passed and how much of each other's life they have missed. She also said, of course, it was great that they have found each other, but that doesn't mean that anything that has happened is automatically forgotten.
In which way has the separation affected the life of Katrin and her mother?
Ja, ich würde sagen, die Trennung.
I believe that separation is the trauma that determines both of their lives. Katrin told me herself that she is still hurting, even after all those years. She still thinks a lot about the times they have missed. She also said that her experience has made her physically sick. She's unable to work in her profession. I guess we could say that she's also one of those broken existences, always thinking about what could have been and how beautiful life could have been if it had been completely different. I think this way of thinking will probably never go away.
You are a mom yourself. What do you feel when you deal with stories like this?
Since I have become a mother, I'm extremely sensitive when it comes to stories of suffering children or injustice done to children. If I had to imagine that my son would be taken away from me while I am completely unable to do anything against it, this thought really terrifies me. I cannot imagine anything worse than that. This is really the worst.
In 2008, Katrin Beer has founded an organization for children that were forcefully separated from their family and that have been adopted afterwards. What does this organization do?
This organization educates people about this topic. They try to support and connect people. People can publish search notices on their website, which has already helped to bring multiple families back together. Also, they try to process and inform people about the political and legal backgrounds of forced adoption. But even though they wish to help every individual, they also focus on making sure that the topic is not forgotten.
In the context of the Afstandsmoeders in the Netherlands, the feeling of shame is mentioned quite often. First, the women were shamed that they got pregnant while they were unmarried, and later they were shamed for the fact that they have given up their babies. And now they're kind of doubting themselves whether they've really done everything to keep their children. Do you have the feeling that this kind of shaming or the feeling of shame is also present among the mothers of the ex-GDR?
Ja, auf jeden Fall. Ich glaube...
Yes, definitely. I believe for a person who has never had to live through such an experience, it is very hard to imagine what this experience must be like and what this does to an individual. Definitely, the feelings of guilt and doubt also existed among the parents in the GDR whose children were taken away. It is very difficult to stay self-confident, of course, to be clear and strong when one is behind the bars in a prison, or after being dismissed as an asocial person unworthy of raising your own children. Many people have been imprisoned for years. They have been interrogated, tortured, blackmailed, and lied to. And naturally, this is a stigma that stays with them, even decades later.
The Afstandskinderen have been very often confronted with a very negative image of their biological mother, often by the adoptive parents. Was this the same in the GDR?
Ja, das haben mir auf jeden Fall Betroffene.
Yes, I have been told so by different people. Katrin Beer, for example, told me that often she thought that her mother simply didn't care about her because she never came looking for her. However, in the end, this also turned out to not be true. Her mother has sent multiple letters, but they were never given to Katrin.
Is there any form of investigation currently or compensation for the people that have been affected?
Among others, the Organization of Forcefully Adopted Children fights for the recognition of the children as politically persecuted persons. But in Germany, even decades later, this topic is not yet fully processed. Few years ago, the German parliament had passed a law to improve legal rehabilitation regulations of politically persecuted people in the ex-GDR. This means that deadlines were set aside for applications which otherwise could have been a problem, with crimes being time-barred. This law also includes an improvement for the situation of the children who were brought into children's homes in the GDR, in form of compensating them for the time they have spent in those homes. Still, this comes with certain restrictions and requirements, which can be difficult to meet, because, as I said before, many documents have disappeared. Therefore, the proofs are missing. But still, they are working on it.
Anne Klesse, thank you very much.
Danke dir auch.
Now we have heard from journalist Anne Klesse how the system worked in the GDR and how it was justified to separate parents and children. Now I will talk to a woman who had to go through this terrible experience herself. Regina Laban was born in 1951 on Usedom in the former GDR. Later she met Karl-Heinz and they got married. When Karl-Heinz refused to join the SED, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, and the leading party in the GDR, the problems began. When the two officially applied for an exit visa in 1980, the situation escalated. Welcome, Regina Laban.
Hello.
You were born into the system of the GDR. As a child, teenager, or a young adult, did you notice anything negative?
I was born in 1951. I have first-hand experienced how many people were expropriated in the 50s and 60s, among them my parents. Expropriation meant everybody who owned a farm at that time had to join an association, as Lenin and Stalin had ordered. The second thing was that when somebody's parents were not system conformed, it didn't matter how smart that person was. It was absolutely impossible for them to get accepted into a university.
In the GDR, the separation of parents and their children was very often justified by the parents being considered asocial. Was this also the case with you?
Ja und nein.
Yes and no. First, we were considered asocial, and later we were seen as people unable to raise their children according to the socialist idea.
You have officially applied for an exit visa. What happened afterwards?
When we wrote the application for an exit visa, not much has happened at first. Then, when we have noticed that it was anyway pretty pointless, we have applied for a stateless status instead. And then things suddenly happened very quickly. Directly from their school, our children were brought into a children's home, and we have spent the entire day searching for them. We were really worried, because they didn't come home from the school. In the end, we went to the authorities of the state security, and they immediately informed us that because we have applied for the exit visa and for the statelessness, they had taken our children to children's homes.
How old were your children when they were brought into this children's home? Were they adopted afterwards?
They were 9, 7, and 4 years old. They have constantly pressured us to give up 4 years old for adoption. But since we had previously gotten the advice to not sign any documents of the state security and we refused to sign, they were unable to give him to another family.
What kind of place was this children's home? Did your children ever talk about it?
Yes, later we went there with our children to have a look at this place. But apart from that, the children barely speak of the experiences they had there. They have suppressed most of it. But this is not only the case with our children. Women I know whose children have been brought into children's homes also experience the same. They don't wish to talk about it.
Was it an option back then to give your children to other members of your family so they could take care of them?
This was never an option for us, because as soon as children were given to other family members, these family members also got into the focus of the state security with several reprisals.
You have been arrested multiple times, and finally you've been brought to the prison Hoheneck, which was the biggest prison for women in the GDR. What kind of place was that?
This prison was an awful place. Political prisoners were crammed into cells with murderers. Crammed is the correct word to describe it. These were women who had murdered their children, partners, lovers, often in awfully brutal ways, as they have told us. Within this prison, there was a hierarchy of inmates. At the very top, there were those who had murdered their husbands, then those who had murdered their children, then a few other crimes, and at the very bottom, there were the political prisoners. A political prisoner had pretty much everybody against them. In prison Hoheneck, we were considered scum. And you have to imagine, into one cell, I don't know the size of it now by heart, they jammed in 3 bunk beds. This means there were 36 women in one cell. I remember that in my cell, there were 34 murderesses, 1 woman who had embased money, and me as a political prisoner. This type of a situation was similar for most of the political prisoners. It was best to just crouch down into a corner and to not move at all, to not draw any attention. Also, the food and the medical treatments were simply horrible. Most people will find this very hard to imagine. For our initial examination at the prison, we had to see an external gynecologist who came in to the prison. She examined 10 women at the same time with the door wide open and only using one single glove for all of them. Once I had very strong toothache, but I only went to see the dentist one single time while I was in there. The equipment looked like it had come from the 18th century. Still, the worst is, they gave us pills and injections without telling us what they were giving to us. Even until today, we never got to know. Similar situation was with the food. The potato sacks which we have got delivered had a label clearly stating, not meant for human consumption. All these living conditions were meant to show us one thing. We have the power, we are in charge, and we will destroy you.
Wir haben die Macht, wir machen dich kaputt.
After being released from Hoheneck, you have been expelled from the GDR. Did you try to find your children afterwards?
We were immediately brought into a refugee camp in Marienfelde, and the West German government immediately provided us with a lawyer to claim our children back. We also stood at a checkpoint Charlie in Berlin with a huge banner. Photos of this can still be found in my file in the state security.
In one of our preparation meetings, you said that in the GDR children were always political. What do you mean by that?
The state security systematically used children to blackmail the parents who wanted to leave the GDR. In these children's homes, the children were constantly told bad things about their parents, or they were told that their parents had died in a car accident. Well, how were such young children supposed to know that barely anybody had a car in the GDR? This was meant to get the children used to the thought that they will soon be living with new parents. For me, this is political, because the state security had their own professionals hired for that, and they really brainwashed our children.
How many years have passed since you were separated from your children until you saw them again? And how did they react when they met you again?
9 Jahre. Nee, Quatsch, 7 Jahre.
It took 7 years. The final reunion with our children was really great. They also recognized us immediately. When we were in West Germany, but our children were still in the GDR, we have also managed to send them letters and packages via detours. That way we also received photos and letters from our children. But of course, the state security knew about this. Later we also discovered another arrest warrant for us should we ever set foot on the territory of the GDR again, for example, to visit our children or our friends.
Sollen wir sofort verhaftet werden?
How did this experience affect you as a family, and how is your relationship today?
Ich muss sagen, das Verhältnis war von
I have to say our relationship has been very good from the start. But since they were still children, it took them a very long time to be able to trust us again. If, for example, we have told them something, they have first waited to see. Obviously, they wanted to see if what we had told them would really happen. And today, we are always there for them. When today our children or our grandchildren call and ask for something, we immediately go there to support them.
und sind sofort da und helfen.
How does it make you feel today when you think about the fact that your family and so many other families have been separated by this unrightful system?
Hass. Hass. Ganz einfach Hass.
Hate.
Und so geht das
Hate.
nur mir.
I simply feel only hate. And it is not only me who feels like that, because those who were responsible back in that days never had to face the justice. They are still hiding behind the fact that those were the laws of the GDR. I will tell you 2 extreme examples of people whom I know. In prison Hoheneck, there was a female guard who was an educator during my time there, and today she is the woman's representative of the Ministry of Justice in the federal state of Saxony. This was the first example, and here comes the second one. A former officer of the state security who was the right hand of Margot Honecker and who was responsible for the system of forced adoption. This man runs a luxurious spa hotel on the island of Usedom. They were all big shots in the GDR, and today they receive a large pension and they laugh about us who are struggling to have our claims recognized. Even today, when my husband and I travel to Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, the federal state where we come from, we still get insulted and called traitors by the officials.
Have you ever received a compensation for what has happened to you?
Yes, we have all received a little compensation. But how can it be possible to compensate a trauma, mental torture, and all the other long-term damages which are now visible among former prisoners?
Today, you are the chairwoman of the Hoheneck Women's Circle. What do you do and what do you want to achieve?
We want to be invited to as many schools as possible in order to explain to young people what it is to live like in a dictatorship. Many young people take the state of the democracy as a given right, and they don't even think about it. In most history classes today also, the second German dictatorship is not really a topic. They only speak about the first dictatorship, even though the second dictatorship had already started in 1946 with the Soviets and the Communists and continued until 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Do you see any similarities of the situation of the Afstandsmoeders and the Netherlands and the prisoners in the GDR?
The women in the GDR were often provided with a lawyer, even though that had zero impact. Whether the women had a lawyer or an organization to help them, regardless, it was already clear how their situation is going to end.
What can we do to make sure that situations like the Afstandsmoeders in the Netherlands or the forced adoption in the GDR never happen again?
We need to inform, and we need to educate. Young people need to understand the value of a democracy. They need to understand how important it is to rise against a dictatorship or a dictator. It is not enough to rely on historians. We see this every year when groups of young people meet with us. When they hear our experiences and our life stories, they finally see the second German dictatorship with very different eyes. And this is why our approach is, we need to explain and we need to denounce.
Aufklären, anprangern. Anprangern, aufklären.
Regina Laban, thank you very much.
Bitte.
Thanks for listening. This was Separated by Force, Afstandsmoeders in the Netherlands. If you like this podcast, please feel free to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcast. If you want to support our cause, please share this podcast in your social media to reach the utmost attention for the injustice that has been done to Afstandsmoeders and their children in the Netherlands and all over the world. Thank you very much and have a great day.